This is part 2 of a 6-part video series. Recall where we left off in part 1. We had identified 3 pages in The Catcher in the Rye, pages 132, 133, and 134 that Kubrick had called attention to. And what we are going to try to do now is correlate these 3 pages to the 3 sections of the page that was in the typewriter that Wendy Torrance was looking at in The Shining. Also recall that Kubrick had given us a couple encouraging clues that we are on the right track. Remember that, the appearance of the words Vermont on page 132 and 134, and the appearance of the word scream on page 133. You can check the last few minutes of part 1 if you need to be reminded of these clues which Kubrick has provided for us. Armed with these encouraging set of circumstances, the next step is to compare section 1 with page 132. Specifically, I want to start with this V line, line 1.5, with line 5 on page 132. There's quite a bit going on here, and I'll let you pause the video if you want and digest what's going on. At this point, I think it's clear that we're on to something. It's not exactly clear what it is we're on to, but I just think that the set of circumstances we're dealing with here clearly point to our being on the right track. We're following the trail that Kubrick wants us to follow, and the thing to do is press on to the next step and see what we can see. I do want to emphasize a couple things here. Take note of the errors on line 1.5 there up at the top. The typos occur at the 17th, 18th, and 24th character spots. What I want to focus on is that 24th spot there. The 24th character on line 5 on page 132 is the E there in the word he. If you get a ruler, you can verify that E is at the very center of the text there. It's in the exact center, and that's going to be an important aspect to focus on as we continue. The next step is to bring the rest of the lines from section 1 of the typo page into play here. Now, if we assume that line 1.5 goes with line 5, then it's reasonable to further assume that say lines 1.3 goes with line 3 and line 1.7 goes with line 7, and so on and so forth. And you can see that on the right hand side of this slide here I've labeled the corresponding line and page which each one of these typo lines is associated with. As you can see, I'm really only interested in the lines which have typos in them. I regard the non-typo lines as filler. I think what's going on here is Kubrick is calling our attention to specific lines in Catcher in the Rye by through the use of these typo lines. So they're the ones that I am going to be using going forward. What I've done here is I've highlighted the lines on page 132 which correspond to the deviation lines in section 1 of the typo page, lines 3, 5, 11, 13, and 15. Also note that on the far right hand side there of the slide I've listed the specific typographical error which each of the deviation lines in section 1 contains. Now, the basic assumption here is that the message Kubrick is trying to relay to us is composed of the letters in these lines, and what we have to do now is figure out which one of these letters he wants us to use. With this in mind, I want you to pay attention to line 3 and its associated error, the misspelled word makes. If we take the assumption that Kubrick is using these typographical errors to guide us in some way, then this misspelled word makes with the two M's would draw our attention to the words Greenwich Village, because both of these words have an instance of consecutive same letters. I remember really scrutinizing these two words here, trying to find some significance to them, and then it finally hit me. The C in Greenwich is directly above the E in line 5 there, the E that's in the exact center of the page. And furthermore, if you draw a vertical line from E down, you find that the T in line 11 there, the A in line 13, and the two L's in line 15, they all line up perfectly with this 24th character, that E there in line 5. With this epiphany, Kubrick's intention now seems to be coming into focus. What he's done is he has constructed a grid consisting of two vertical columns and a series of rows. The rows consist of the lines of text in these 3 pages in Catcher in the Rye, and the specific lines or rows that we use are designated by the error page, the typo page that we've been using all along. The location and width of the two vertical columns are determined by the errors that were found in line 1.5. Recall that the error locations were the 17th and 18th characters and the 24th character. The wider column there on the left has its location and width determined by characters 17 and 18 in line 5, and the narrow column there in the exact center is determined by the location and width of the letter E. And most importantly, the letters which are found at the intersection of these columns and rows are the letters which constitute the message that Kubrick is trying to convey to us. What I've done on this slide is I've constructed as precisely as I am able the grid pattern that Kubrick has created, and you can see on the right hand side there the letters which are found at these intersections, and I want to just briefly explain the nomenclature I'm using. Let's start at line 3 at the top there. As you can see, that letter, capital letter G, is wholly contained within that intersection. And I refer to letters like this that are either entirely or substantially contained as solid letters. So that's a solid letter G. The R in Greenwich, immediately after the G there, if you look closely, is mostly contained in that intersection, but there's a portion of it that isn't. I refer to letters like this that have, say, I don't know, 30% or more of itself contained in these intersections as marginal. So that's a marginal R, and it's marked with an asterisk. Moving on to the next letter, we have the letter I, and it appears to be bisected by that line. So that's another instance of a marginal letter. The C is clearly wholly contained, so that's a solid C. And the last letter is that I'd like to discuss on this line is that letter H. If you look closely, very little of that H is contained in the grid. However, a small portion of it is intersected on that far right-hand line. I'm marking letters like this with a question mark, and I'm referring to them as questionable because it's not clear at all whether or not these letters are intended to be used in the message that Kubrick wants us to see. We have to keep in mind that Kubrick was not in a position to spoon-feed us explicit messages. And so the fact is we're just going to have to deal with some ambiguity and grind through them as we proceed. And this nomenclature that I've adopted is my way of dealing with these various levels of ambiguity. It's a way to just keep track of how to regard these various letters as we go forward. Having said that, you can now look at the rest of the letters that have been decoded from this page on this page 132. Having done all this, it's now time to proceed to the next page, page 133. Doing so, we are immediately faced with two problems. The first problem is, as you can see there on the lower right corner, is how do we assign the deviation lines in section 2 to the lines on page 133. Recall from section 1 that Kubrick had that Roman numeral 5, which told us that that line was associated with line 5 on page 132. However, there is no such hint for this section, section 2. One possible path forward is to simply assume that line 2.5 goes to line 5, and line 2.9 goes to line 9, and so on and so forth, basically like what we ended up doing in section 1. The problem I have with doing that is that Kubrick doesn't give us any indication that that's what we should do for this particular section. And I take the position that we should really strive to take whatever hints we can find from Kubrick as to which path to take. With that in mind, it turns out that we've already seen a hint as to what to do. Recall the ice cream note on that billboard there. Recall also that word scream appeared on 133, and not only that, it is the first word on line 11. If we interpret the phrase I scream as read the word scream, then that would be an indication to us that we would assign line 2.1 to line 11 and go from there. So I'm going to run with that hint, and as you can see on the section 2 area there on the right hand side, I've assigned line 11 to 2.1. That would mean that deviation line 2.5 is assigned to line 15, and so on until we reach the end of section 2 here. And as you can see here, the deviation lines from section 2 have been assigned to their proper locations on page 133. And I said earlier that we had two problems. The second problem, as you can see, is how do we assign the location and width of the columns for this page? I believe the best way to proceed is to simply transfer the columns from page 132 as they are and move them directly to page 133 using their same width and location. And I'd like to take a few minutes to justify to you that mode of thinking. Recall there were a couple special characteristics of line 1.5, as you can see there at the top. The first one was, of course, the Roman numeral 5. The other aspect of this line that set it apart was that it had 42 characters, counting the spaces. 42 being one of our two magic numbers, along with the number 10. As I mentioned before, in section 2 there is no Roman numeral or any other numerical designation on the left-hand margin there. Furthermore, as you can see, lines 2.5, 2.9, and 2.13 all have the number of characters not equal to 42, which in my mind eliminates them as potential candidates. 42 just seems like a really important number, and if these lines don't have 42 characters, then I don't think they should be considered. Now turn your attention to line 2.11. As you can see, I have a question mark there, and the reason is, if you look closely at the P in play, you'll notice that that character spot there has actually two letters, a P and an L. In my mind, this muddies the water as to whether or not there are 42 characters in this line, strictly speaking. And turning your attention to line 2.15, the only error in that line occurs at the very end of the line, at the 42nd character spot. If we use this line to generate a vertical column, that would mean we would have just one column, one character wide, and that doesn't seem right to me. I admit there's some subjectivity here, but looking at these deviation lines in section 2, I see nothing here which indicates that we are supposed to use any of these lines to generate the vertical columns as we did in section 1 with 1.5. And finally, with this particular edition of Catcher in the Rye, in the upper right corner of each page, there's the page number, and then they have the title, as you can see. And that batch of characters is in the same spot on page 132 as it is on 133. And as you can see, Kubrick set up his vertical columns so that all four of those lines intersect that title there in some spot. So it's very easy and convenient to use that as a marker to transfer those lines to the same spot on page 133 as it is on 132. So as you can see, that is what I'm going to do. Now finally we are at the point where we can decode the letters, and as you can see, I've done that, and I'm following the same pattern on this page as I did on 132, the same nomenclature I mean. And I do want to point out that I will be summarizing the letters we are decoding here in a table later on. Now it's time to move on to page 134, and the first thing we can do right off the bat is draw the column lines, as you see I have done. I'm simply putting the columns on page 134 in the same spot as we have done on pages 132 and 133. We are, however, faced with the same problem we faced in the previous section, or on page 133. That is, how do we assign the deviation lines to the proper lines on page 134? Recall from page 133 that Kubrick gave us a hint with that ice cream notice on the billboard there in the telephone room. And since the word scream was the first word on line 11 of page 133, that gave us the hint to assign the typo line number 2.1 to that line. It turns out that we have a similar clue to work with for page 134. Recall the point in the movie when Wendy told the doctor that she was from Vermont. Now, on page 134, it turns out that the word Vermont is the last word on line 31. If we take the phrase "from Vermont" literally in this case, that would mean that our first deviation line, line 3.1, gets assigned to line 32 of page 134. This seems reasonable, so as you can see, I've assigned deviation line 3.1 to 32, and so then deviation line 3.3 would get line 34 on page 134, and so on and so forth, as you can see. However, when you look at the bottom there, the very last deviation line, line 3.9, would get assigned to line 40. And it turns out this is actually a pretty big problem, because as you can see, there is no line 40 on page 134. In fact, there's no line 40 on any page in this edition of Catcher in the Rye. The maximum amount of text lines on each page is 38. And as I've just said, this is a very big and perhaps fatal problem, because it potentially pulls the rug out from under this set of assumptions that I've been making to get to this point. One possible solution is to continue on to the next page, page 135, but that would violate our assumption that these three sections in the typo page correspond to exactly 3 pages in Catcher in the Rye. We could proceed with the assumption that this last deviation line should be just discarded, but then that would violate the assumption that each of these deviation lines means something, that these typos are directing us to specific lines in Catcher in the Rye. And at this point it would appear that I'm dead in the water, and I wouldn't blame you if you were more than a little annoyed at spending all this time following me, and now it appears that I've been all wet all along. But before you turn to another YouTube channel in disgust, I want you to hear me out here, because I believe that Kubrick has provided us with a clue to help us with this situation. Recall from our discussion on page 132 that it was the typographical error in line 1.3, the dual M in makes, which encouraged me to scrutinize the words Greenwich Village, each of which had a series of 2 consecutive identical letters. And this led to the realization that the C in Greenwich was directly above the E in he, and it led to the realization that Kubrick had set up a grid pattern. As I said before, I believe that was intentionally done by Kubrick to direct us down the path we needed to go. One could say that these deviation lines serve multiple purposes. One purpose is to direct us to specific lines in Catcher in the Rye, and another purpose is to provide us with clues as to how to proceed. With that in mind, I want to direct your attention to deviation line 3.9 in the bottom half of the page there. This line has multiple typographical errors, but one of them is that the word play is missing the A. It's misspelled as ply. It's not easy to make out, but if you look at it closely, that is indeed the case. Now, why is this significant? The word ply has several meanings, and I've included the 2 most relevant meanings here. I've copied and pasted these definitions directly from an online dictionary. If we take the position that Kubrick is trying to give us a hint, then this word ply works for us on 2 different levels. We could look at these extraneous lines in section 3 as a laminate or layer, which can be twisted or folded around. And there are 2 different approaches we can take from this point, which I will illustrate on the next slide. We can assign the typo line 3.6 to line 32, or we can assign 3.6 to line 35. With method 1, deviation line would end up at line 35, which as you can see is open. The other method, method 2, results in 3.9 ending up at line 32, which is already taken by deviation line 3.1. Method 1, I think, is the best way to proceed. That would put deviation line 3.9 at an open spot. So that's how we're going to proceed from here. As you can see in the lower right corner, I've made the changes to section 3 so that to reflect this situation where 3.9 ends up at line 35 of page 134. In case you are thinking I'm grasping at straws here, I do want to point out that Kubrick has given us an indication that this is the correct thing to do. If you look closely at deviation line 3.9, he has also capitalized the K, the E, and the S in makes. And when you add the numerical value of those letters, you get 35. And now, finally, we can proceed with determining the decoded letters from page 134, and I've done that here, and I'm following the same nomenclature as I am on the first two pages, pages 132 and 133. I'd like to take a quick aside here and address the question, why is Kubrick doing this to us? That is, on the very last deviation line, he throws this curveball at us, and it's reasonable to ask, why is he doing this? One reason, I think, is that by throwing in these obstacles which require solutions which are subject to interpretation, Kubrick is giving himself a layer of plausible deniability. Keep in mind, he knew that this movie, The Shining, would be seen by millions of people all over the world, and by doing things like this, he gives himself some camouflage as to what his true intent is. But also, I think what's going on here is Kubrick is having a little bit of fun with us. Kubrick did have his own brand of humor. It was a dark and a sarcastic and biting humor. I'm thinking of movies like Dr. Strangelove and Full Metal Jacket, and I think he's just having a little bit of fun here. And on top of that, he did enjoy games like chess, and I think he's just rattling our cages a bit. As another quick aside, I want to give you what I think is an important tip if you want to construct your own decoding grid. Maybe you want to check my work, or maybe you think there's a better way to do this, and that's fine. One thing you should keep in mind, I believe, is that the body of text on the page may be skewed from the perfectly vertical line which is parallel to the edge of the page. And I think it's very important that you construct your columns in the following way. When you draw your vertical lines for your decoding columns, I think it's very important that they be parallel to the text margin line, the red line there that you can see, and not to the perfectly vertical line which is parallel to the edge of the physical page. So just a word to the wise. What I'd like to do now is just quickly summarize the final versions of our typo pages and just group together the results that we've gotten from the decoded pages 132, 133, and 134. In particular, what I would like to do is show you this summary table I've come up with. It is basically, it just summarizes everything that we've worked through. And you might want to look at this on a full screen mode because it is a bit of an eye chart, but there it is. One thing I want to call your attention to in particular is the far left-hand column there titled typo number. Recall there are 13 deviation lines in the typewriter page, and what I've done is I've assigned each one of them a number, numbers 1 through 13. The next step will be to focus on the decoded letters and to try to form them into the message that Stanley Kubrick wants us to see. To facilitate that, I've taken the letters that are in Table 1 and rearranged them so that we can more efficiently see what letters we have, how many of them, and what is their status in terms of ambiguity. Are they solid? Are they marginal? Are they questionable? And so that's what is done here in this table. So we have a whole bunch of letters, and the question is, how do we proceed from here? What are we supposed to do to as a first step to figure out what Kubrick is trying to tell us? One possible course of action would be the brute force method. That is, we try to just grind through the letters and try to find any possible message that we think Kubrick would want to send us. But I think there is a more efficient way to go about this. Recall near the beginning of part 1, I said that I wanted to defer until a later time what I think a lot of the imagery in The Shining is referring to. The reason I wanted to do that is because I believe a careful consideration of some of the images we see in this movie will help us to begin the process of forming a message from these letters. And I'm going to do that in the next part 3. We're going to return to the movie and analyze these images, and we will come to some understanding as to where to begin.